Welcome to Adventures in Theater History. Here on this show, we try to bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. Hello, I'm Peter Schmitz, and I'm supported, as ever, by the music and the sound design of Christopher Mark Colucci. As we like to say around here, this is not just a show about Philadelphia or for Philadelphians. It's for everybody. We are attempting to tell a larger story about American theater history and America in general, but we're doing it mainly by looking around and finding the stories that happened right here where we are, because it turns out that there was a lot going on right here where we are in Philadelphia. We have two stories for you today, both about prestigious international theater artists coming to Philadelphia only to be met by some who called their work indecent, profane, and objectionable. In the overall timeline of the show, we are now at about 1911, 1912. This was an era of revolutions in the world at large, political, social, sexual, and cultural. Here in sleepy old Philadelphia, some folks were really alarmed about that. And since live theater was a major element in most people's lives in that time, the battle often started in the Quaker City's lobbies and in their audiences and spread right onto its stages. From the 18th century onward, as we've detailed in the early episodes of this podcast, there had been a deep suspicion by many Philadelphians towards the theater in general, though that had mostly disappeared by the 1790s. Still, throughout the 19th century, there were still quite a number of attacks on the theater by some city newspaper editors, certainly by clergymen, and often by politicians. In the late 19th century, American musical comedies and burlesque shows in particular, with their large choruses of beautiful young women in alluring clothing, particularly drew fire from pulpits and moral scolds. But today's show is about calls for actual censorship in the theater of the early 20th century. And we will illustrate it by bringing you these two specific stories. It's all part of our continuing season 2, because these stories should be seen as a definite continuation of our episodes about the play The Quaker City back in the 1840s, The Klansman in 1906, and the opera Salome in 1909. Censorship is a topic that has sudden relevance in American society once again today, here in 2023. And there are public campaigns for eliminating so-called offensive books from school libraries, and self-appointed censors are once again roiling the media with alarming warnings about the end of morality and decency, while many lawmakers scurry to pass legislation protecting children from the supposed dangers of ravenous sex perverts, political ideologues, and social revolutionaries. And like many exasperated professional historians, I'm also trying to point out that we've seen all of this before, and in the long run, this never turns out well. I'm pretty sure that no one on the side of the censorious is actually listening to me or really, cares what is said on a little podcast like this one. But I'm here to say it anyway, because as we'll all see today, in a very real way, the present historical moment makes all the more clear that there are periods in the theater when drama is conflict. December 20th, 1910, the Reverend Dr. George Chalmers Richmond, the rector of St. John's Protestant Episcopal Church on Brown Street in Philadelphia's Northern Liberties neighborhood, was on his way to New York City. Dr. Richmond had been sent by his bishop on a specific mission to gather evidence about Sarah Bernhardt and her sacrilegious play La Samaritaine before they got to Philadelphia. Madame Bernhardt, the most famous theater actress in the world, was now 66 years old. She was touring America for the 8th time in the last 33 years. And as always, she had brought along with her a company of French actors and her standard repertoire of both classic and modern French plays, among which was her famous portrayal of the teenage heroine Joan of Arc, in which Bernhardt sent a thrill through the audience every time she defiantly announced her age to her persecutors in the play. J'ai 16 ans! I am 16! Though in fact she was now decades older than all the characters she was playing, and although few Americans actually spoke or understood French in which she performed these plays, audience flocked to see her because she was famous wherever she went. She was a sensation in Kansas City, as well as New York, in San Francisco, as well as Boston, as well as Des Moines. She had played Philadelphia numerous times over the years, most recently in 1906. Now, Bernhardt did have a few extra challenges on this tour. First, there was this pain in her bad right leg, which had been bothering her for years. Eventually, it would result in the leg's amputation, but we weren't at that point yet. Second, there was the effort to keep certain stories out of the paper about her love affair with Lou Tellichen, a man 37 years her junior. Lou Tellichen was a beautiful fellow, but no acting talent whatsoever. He had a pronounced Dutch accent when he spoke French, actually, but nonetheless, Bernhardt had made him her leading man in many of her plays, as well as in, well, her private life. And even in public, she doted on him whenever they were out together. On stage, he appeared with her in such plays as Phèdre, La Tosca, La Dama Camélia, L'Aiglon, Sappho, La Sorcière, and La Samaritaine. Now, this last play, its title translates to The Samaritan Woman, had attracted the ire of one vigilant American Christian in particular, Mr. Edward Feeney of New York, the president of the American Federation of Catholic Societies. Mr. Feeney, and here I'm going to note an exception because most of the Blue Noses we're going to talk about today rarely actually set foot inside a theater, had been to see Bernhardt's plays, and he announced that he was scandalized by almost her entire repertoire as she blithely switched back and forth between holy and profane roles. Why, she would play the Blessed Saint Joan on one night, and then the courtesan Camille the next, and then, worst of all, to the mind of Mr. Feeney at least, was La Samaritaine. La Samaritaine was a biblical play by Edmond Rostand, and Bernhardt appeared on stage in this play as a Samaritan woman offering water from the well of Jacob to another actor playing Jesus Christ. You can find the story in the Gospel of John, chapter 4. But according to Mr. Feeney, it was outrageous to have Christ personified on stage. He publicly demanded that the mayor of New York City ban this play from being performed. Bernhardt, for her part, scornfully rebuked Feeney in the New York newspapers. Why, this play had been composed on purpose to be performed in Paris during Easter week, and everyone there loved it. She could assure Mr. Feeney that there were just as many good Catholics in Europe as there were in America. At any rate, said Bernhardt, she refused to pull the play. The great and noble American people will be the judge, she declared, except, in French, but that's why my accent's there. Word of this public dispute reached the ears of prominent clergymen in Philadelphia, where Bernhardt's tour would be arriving in just 2 months. Now, this was why George Chalmers Richmond had been dispatched by Bishop Rhinelanders of the Episcopal Church with instructions to bring back all the details as to why this scandalous play should be condemned and banned, so that he could then bring the evidence to the attention of the mayor of Philadelphia. Now, down in Philadelphia, there was already a group up in arms against the play, the Christian League, a multi-denominational organization who, as you may remember, had already led a battle against the production of the opera Salome at the Hammerstein Opera House the previous year. The Christian League now declared its opposition to the French actress's blasphemy too. They were a little confused, perhaps because Bernhardt had played a male role in one other Rostand drama, L'Aiglon. We talked about it in an earlier episode. The League thought that they knew the role she was going to enact in this other play. She was going to play Jesus. No performance of La Samaritaine with Sarah Bernhardt in the role of Jesus Christ will be given in this city if the Christian League can prevent it, they declared. And it just got worse from there. There were articles every day in the papers, and Philadelphia's pulpits once again rang with denunciations of the wicked stage. In all, over 400 clergymen signed a petition decrying Bernhardt and the Rostand play. Sarah Bernhardt, for her part, when she heard of this new kerfuffle breaking out, pronounced herself completely baffled. Why should Philadelphia object to so great, so beautiful a play? Christ was currently being depicted in these newfangled moving pictures, the cinematograph, and no one has objected, she pointed out. What was so wrong about seeing him in live theater? But on January 30th, 1911, the mayor of Philadelphia, James E. Rayburn, bowed to the 2-month-long pressure campaign. He formerly had refused to ban Salome, but now he felt he could not hold back the firestorm any longer, and the mayor's edict, set forth in a telegram to the city's director of public safety, read, quote, "Withdraw all police protection from the Broad Street Theater Wednesday and Friday afternoons during performance of La Samaritaine. Notify owners of theater that their license for these afternoons is suspended. That is, if these performances are given, it is without the sanction of the law and entirely upon their own responsibility." Signed, James E. Rayburn, Mayor. The Protestant minister Carl E. Grammer, who, along with the Reverend Russell H. Conwell, the founder and president of Temple University in Philadelphia, had organized a large public meeting against the play that very same day, and he read the telegram from Mayor Rayburn to the entire meeting, and everyone pronounced themselves satisfied and joined in on the applause. There were, however, 2 major dissenters out of all the city of Philadelphia's prominent clergymen and politicians who had joined the crusade against La Samaritaine. One was the Rabbi Emanuel Schreiber, who was, of course, not Christian, of the congregation Beth El, who had publicly expressed his opinion that the play perhaps conveyed a great moral lesson about tolerance and forgiveness. Rabbi Schreiber pointed out that this play was no more objectionable than the famous passion play of Oberammergau in Germany, which, after all, also had a human actor playing Jesus Christ, did it not? But the good rabbi's opinions were discounted by most in the group of Christian clergymen condemning the play, and, after all, he was Jewish, as was Sarah Bernhardt herself, at least by birth. The only prominent Christian dissenter that I can find was our friend Reverend George Chalmers Richmond, who, as you recall, had actually seen Bernhardt's performance when he was in New York. But though he had been explicitly sent on this mission to condemn Bernhardt, instead, as he sat in the theater, the great French actress had worked her magic, and she had converted him to the side of art. Chalmers now felt that the play should not only be allowed by Philadelphia, it should be attended by every good Christian in the city. In his sermon to his parishioners at St. John's, Richmond said, "In the days past, the Church has always given her blessings to the gifts of consecrated genius, and in La Samaritaine we see this genius. It is as good as a sermon. Such demonstrations as the one recently witnessed in our city, condemning the work of a great world genius even before the play has been seen, is only sure to injure the Church in the estimation of men." But, unfortunately, Mayor Rayburn, even if he ever heard this particular sermon, would have been unmoved. He had political constituencies to placate after all, and the ban on the play stood. Sarah Bernhardt, well, she had perhaps learned to be accustomed to the odd way of American moral crusaders. she just shrugged in a proper Gaelic manner and calmly replaced the play in her schedule of Philadelphia performances at the Broad Street Theatre with another one, the conventionally scandalous melodrama Madame X. But the Reverend Dr. Richmond's superior, Episcopal Bishop Rhinelander, however, never forgave the pastor of St. John's Church for this betrayal over La Samaritaine. The two men frequently thereafter were in some conflict, and a few years later, Richmond actually called Rhinelander a Pharisee, which, would never do, and he was brought up on charges with the Episcopal Church Council and dismissed from the ministry. But that was not the end of the crisis in the theater story. Because after all this uproar, somebody in power decided that they had to do something even more about this whole problem of immorality on the American stage. There was going to be a new theatrical censorship law in Philadelphia, indeed, throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In February 1911, Pennsylvania State Senator Joe McNichol introduced a bill in the legislature prohibiting the presentation of objectionable plays, and that was directed at operas, vaudeville, movies, or any other type of theatrical performance. The penalty for conviction under this law was $1,000 or 1 year in prison, or both. When asked why such a law was necessary, Senator McNichol specifically cited Salome and La Samaritaine. If I had my way, it would apply to Mary Garden and some of her operas, and to every other opera or play, moving picture, or anything that tends to corrupt the morals of our boys and girls and seeks to profane sacred subjects. I am against them all, said McNichol. The law was passed, and by June of 1911, much to the alarm and dismay of Philadelphia's theatrical managers, who felt they should be left to run their own businesses as they saw fit, now, anyone in Pennsylvania who wanted to run a public campaign against any play or show had a real weapon to attack their opponents with. It was no joke. As the law was written, any person could file a complaint about an indecent show, ask for a citizen's warrant, and get the people running the theater arrested. I should point out here that Senator McNichol was not a conservative, at least not in the political spectrum of the day. In fact, he was a leading reformer, a vocal opponent of the long-standing Penrose Republican Party political machine that had been running Philadelphia for decades. McNichol would be an ally of the next mayor of Philadelphia, Rudolph Blankenberg, who for a brief period in the late 19-teens was to administer one of the few really efficient and non-corrupt Philadelphia political administrations ever. Now, how do we explain Mr. McNichol? Well, it was quite normal then for reform-minded folks to take stands that many of us today would consider quite horrific. Prohibition, forced sterilizations, eugenics, that sort of thing. Cleaning up immorality in the theater was to these folks the same as cleaning up corruption in city politics. Many reformers thought that risque plays only existed because the producers were paying bribes under the table and were working hand in hand with corrupt old guard politicians. And they saw their work as a defense of the moral lives of vulnerable women and innocent children, of the very future of the nation. Of course, today we can see that what they were really protecting was their idealized image of what childhood and femininity was supposed to be like. But again, it's important to remember that political labels of the past don't always line up very well with those of the present. We'll see the evidence of that very clearly in our next story, when another international troupe came to Philadelphia. January 15th, 1912. The Irish Players from Dublin, Ireland, were on an American tour, and they had arrived in Philadelphia to perform at the Adelphi theater. You may remember that the Adelphi was built by the Schubert brothers, along with its twin, the Lyric Theater, just north of City Hall, at the very heart of the city. This touring group was brought in by a New York theatrical manager, and it was shepherded by Isabella Augusta, Lady Gregory herself. Lady Gregory was one of the leading figures of the Irish literary revival that was going on at the time, and at the age of 59, as she was then, she was a major figure in Irish and even world theater. This company was not at all like the many Irish comics and comedians that had been coming through Philadelphia for the past 100 years. Tyrone Power, John Drew Sr., Chauncey Olcott. In this company's repertoire were a number of very interesting and very serious and quite high-quality literary shows, including The Well of the Saints by the playwright J.M. Synge, who had only recently just passed away. There was also an evening of 3 one-acts, including The Showing Up of Blanco Posnet by George Bernard Shaw, The Building Fund by William Boyle, and The Rising of the Moon by Lady Gregory herself. But it was when the company performed their most famous 2 Irish plays ever. The brief one-act, Kathleen Nahulahan by William Butler Yeats, and the 3-act, The Playboy of the Western World, also by J.M. Synge, that the real trouble broke out. As you may know, J.M. Synge's Playboy of the Western World tells the story of a young man, Christy Mahone, who one morning shows up in a remote Western Irish village in County Mayo, boasting that he had just killed his abusive father over in a neighboring town. Rather than turning him into the authorities, everyone in this village marvels at his pluck, and Christy gains the admiration of the local women, including a young lady called Pegeen Mike, as well as an older woman named the Widow Quinn. Now, one line in the play in particular always seemed to upset certain types of people. A shift, a poor woman's undergarment, was mentioned out loud. Now, despite the lovely and lyrical language in which the play was written, this sort of thing was regarded by certain Irish patriots as an insult to the Irish national character and to the moral purity of Irish women in general. And in the play, Christy Mahone wins the love of Pegeen, who even after learning that Christy's father was not really dead, the arrival of the bloodied but very much alive old man is one of the most famous entrances in stage history. Now, Pegeen persists in her admiration for the plucky and handsome Christy, and she even throws over her hapless former suitor, Sean Keogh. The expression of male desire was normalized in the mores of that day, and women were only supposed to, defend their virtue until marriage. If they didn't, they weren't a nice lady. Now, admitting that a nice young female might still have her own erotic life and her own bodily passions, that was something else altogether, and some people were just not having it. At the play's world premiere in Dublin back in 1907, irate Irish patriots had risen from the audience in the middle of the play and began shouting at the players from the audience, demanding that the play stop immediately. A real hoolie ensued. That's a famous story, and perhaps you know it already. It was a time of rising nationalist fervor in Ireland for independence from Great Britain, a political movement that eventually would result in the Easter Rising of 1916, just 4 years on from where we are in our story. But it's less well remembered that when the Irish players, this touring band made up largely of actors from the Abbey Theatre, brought this same play to America, riots exactly like those in Dublin in 1907 broke out almost everywhere they went. There was, after all, a huge Irish diaspora in the U.S., and fraternal Irish-American organizations were simply everywhere, and they had heard from their brethren back in Dublin about this play, and they weren't going to allow it to happen here. They would not have their heritage and their women insulted. Audience protests had occurred in Boston and in New York as the play toured through there in late 1911, And in New York, a stink bomb was even set off in the house one night, which rather tended to spoil the evening. It was no good at all for people to point out that the cast of this play were all Irish patriots themselves, nor was it any use explaining to these protesters that the deeper cultural relevances and the deep affectionate humor for Irish folkways that the piece contained. They felt they were protecting something that was being attacked, and they weren't going to be persuaded otherwise. Now, this wasn't the case with everyone, of course. When this company showed up in Philadelphia, there was much interest in seeing the shows on the part of many Philadelphians. But because of what had happened in previous cities, the authorities had been careful to station policemen, a majority of them, of course, of Irish stock themselves, conspicuously all around the house. Philadelphia's director of public safety was determined not to have another repeat of all the goings-on at the Walnut Street Theater during the Klansmen just 5 years before, after all. But he did not count on the long-held tendency of Philadelphians, documented in many episodes of this podcast, to feel they had a right to express themselves in a theater if they wanted to. The curtain had hardly been up for 10 minutes when Joseph McLaughlin, National Vice President of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, rose from his seat in the center of the orchestra section and yelled, "I protest against this play. It is a shame. Why don't you present the Irish character as it really is?" Well, everybody had been expecting something like this, and even the actors on stage just gamely kept going. But they finally had to give up as other men joined McLaughlin yelling at the stage until police had to escort them out, to the applause of most of the audience. Then the show went on until the second act, when another voice rose from the balcony. "Since time immemorial, no Irishman ever uttered such words as you players have tonight. You and your like are a disgrace to the Irish race." In an instant, the entire house was in a turmoil. More men rose from elsewhere in the house and also began shouting and hurling insults. The house lights were brought up, and fights broke out between protesters and other audience members. The Philadelphia police, who were stationed in the theater, quickly entered and evicted all the rioters. These were arrested and brought to Philadelphia City Hall, which, after all, was just a block away from the theater. And the next night, as the play began, it was even worse. By this point, every newspaper from other American cities were present to see what would happen over in Philly. And, well, they had plenty to write about. Even during the curtain raiser, Kathleen Nahulahan, somebody up in the balcony threw a box of snuff into the air, which caused, of course, the entire audience to cough and to sneeze for the next 10 minutes, drowning out Yeats's little folk play. Once the main event, Playboy the Western World, began, from the very beginning of the show, the Philly police were wrestling a series of shouting men out of the theater. And these guys didn't just yell. The New York Times reported that in the course of the performance, an egg, half a dozen programs, and in the second act, a section of a very moist pie were hurled at the players. The pie shot over the heads of the thrilled audience, leaving its soft trail behind it. More men, at this point, were ejected by the police, and when it was over, 12 hats, mangled beyond recognition, lay in the aisles. Again, in the third act, the protest was repeated. A red-faced individual in the middle of the parquet rose to his feet. Christy Mahone had just reiterated his boast of parricide, and Pegeen Mike and the other Colleens were standing by, awed and worshipful. The rubicund individual in the audience fortified himself with a long pole from a black bottle, and in his left hand he had a manuscript. "In the name of County Down," he began, reading from the manuscript, "I hereby—" But he got no further. A police detective grabbed the orator's coat and hauled him out, without ceremony, to the lobby. Along with all the other ejected men, he was locked up while a crowd of sympathizers thronged the streets outside City Hall. Well, the next day, as you can imagine, the Philly morning newspapers were having a real field day. And then the afternoon papers had an even better story, because that was when the next twist came. In the municipal courtroom dock sat not just all the men who had been arrested the previous evening, but the entire company of the Irish players, including Lady Gregory and the manager of Adelphi Theatre, were sitting in another court. It seemed that Joseph Garrity, a local Philadelphia liquor dealer, had sworn out a warrant against them under that act of 1911 that allowed private citizens to prosecute the producers of an immoral play. Furthermore, 2 Catholic priests, Father McGarity of St. Monica's in South Philly and Father Higgins of the Church of the Blessed Sacrament in West Philly, were present to support Garrity. The 2 clergymen vehemently denounced Playboy the Western World to the judge as being disgustingly immoral, blasphemous, and obscene, a trio of epithets so vivid that I simply had to use it for the title of this episode, for which I thank them both. They and their attorneys then asked for the full $1,000 fine to be imposed, as well as a year's imprisonment. Now, reading over the accounts of the court proceedings in the newspapers today, it's kind of hilarious how much these resemble modern dramaturgy seminars or spirited audience talkback sessions. Father McGarity insisted the play was degrading because it advocated parricide. But Christie didn't murder his father, pointed out the judge with a barely suppressed smile. Well, to all intents and purposes he did, up until the end of the first act, the priest replied. This is a very indecent and insidious plot. I'm happy to report that in the end, the arrested Irish and American theater folk were all set free that same day and were able to do the show that evening at the Adelphi. In fact, they finished up the whole run in Philadelphia without too much more incident, and soon afterwards all formal charges against them were dismissed. Nobody wanted to prosecute anybody under that law because it wasn't going to stand up any judicial review. Lady Gregory and the Irish players received an apology and a farewell message from Mayor Blankenberg, and the tour went on to other American cities and the disputes and the protests of their local Irish populations. And to round it all off, our friend, the Reverend George Chalmers Richmond at St. John's Episcopal Church in Northern Liberties, who at that point was still in possession of his pulpit, preached a happy sermon that Sunday to his congregation. And although he was perhaps a bit too pleased about the defeat of his Irish Catholic colleagues, we can commend him for his sentiments. He too had gone to see Playboy the Western World. Chalmers told his flock, quote, I was not disappointed. I spent 3 happy hours and came away rejoicing. I had had a chance to see real, true, old-fashioned Irish character. The Irish players are an admirable set of actors. We want them to return to our city when bigots and false zealots will not arrange to offer insults and blasphemies to ladies and gentlemen of a most honorable company. Philadelphia is progressing. We want Mr. George Bernard Shaw to know that we now have a mayor who is really appreciative of dramatic genius. Whether that last bit was true or not, and one hopes it was abundantly clear to everyone that the 1911 McNichol law was unenforceable and likely unconstitutional, and the prospect of the Philadelphia courts being endlessly tied up with lectures and lawsuits brought by various political groups and religious fanatics who disliked certain plays just seemed intolerable. A whole city full of potential censors? That was only going to lead to chaos and headaches, as had just been clearly demonstrated in the Adelphi Theatre. And yet, to many, the larger issue remained. What could be done to protect public decency, which was a burning issue of the time? These newfangled moving pictures had the potential especially to take moral values in a whole new, insidious direction. After all, as Sarah Bernhardt had wisely pointed out, if Christ could be in a movie, as well as fallen women in flimsy dresses, what else might folks have to expect from the world of the cinema? Think of the children! So, it was decided to take the whole thing out of the hands of private citizens. What we need is an intervening body, a group of qualified officials. In other words, a professional board of censorship. So that's where we're going to leave it today, ladies and gentlemen. But don't despair. I have got so many great stories about censorship fights in Philly theater from the 1920s and 30s. Stories that are hilarious and charming, and some that are ominous and alarming. This next episode will be out in a couple weeks, just in time for our 2-year anniversary. I won't say the time has flown, because it's been a long and fascinating trip, and I remember all of it. All the time I've spent in libraries and archives and at my desk getting this show together. Chris and I are hoping to keep this thing going for a while. But as the saying goes, hey, we need your help. First, we need your feedback. If you're a new listener or a longtime one, would you write to us? Tell us why you tuned in, why you've kept tuning in, what you're particularly enjoying about the show, or what you'd like to know more about, and that maybe we've missed so far. We would love to hear from you. Our email is aithpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us via our website. Second, there is also a Patreon account for those of you who want more information and images and special posts that are not available elsewhere, and who want to support our work and to see it be able to continue. In fact, right now I'm working on a special bonus episode only for Patreon supporters about how the Klansmen returned to Philadelphia as the film Birth of a Nation in 1915, and a brand new fight broke out in the city about that. So if you don't want to miss that story when it's finally ready, come on board on Patreon. There's a lot more bonus material already there that you might enjoy. And the cost, that's just a few bucks. Look for us on Patreon or find a link in the show notes for the episode. It will take you right there. So long for now. Thank you so much for listening today and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.